This is the brand new Google Pixel 10 Pro XL. This is the Vivo X200 Ultra, and this is the Oppo Find X8 Ultra. In this video, we'll compare the photo and video capabilities of these three top-tier camera phones. Alright friends, let's go. Hey friends, this video was translated using AI, so the sound quality isn't the best. If you want to listen to the original sound from the smartphones and hear the audio recording test, just follow the link to our original video in the description. All the smartphones are charged to 100%. Let's start filming. And our first test, as tradition dictates, is 4K at 60 frames per second using the front-facing camera. Google has the widest angle right now. Vivo's is a bit narrower, and Oppo's angle is roughly the same as Vivo's, again. What do we see in terms of quality and color reproduction? The Pixel has an overall quite contrasty image, with a pinkish skin tone, and the detail rendering is roughly the same as on the Oppo. The Vivo has the most detailed and contrasty image, but the skin tone leans towards orange. I'm also noting that there's a slight optical blur of the background only in the center. But of course, what really stands out is how much the video shakes. This is despite the fact that the smartphone is centered on the tripod, while the competitors on the sides keep the image stable. The Oppo image is the flattest. It really lacks contrast. At the same time, it's very bright, and the skin tones are oversaturated. The front-facing camera on the Pixel works best when shooting against the light. The sky is rendered excellently. There's almost no overexposure. But personally, I don't particularly like the foreground. It's quite pale and dark. Vivo's result is brighter and more saturated. The sky is more overexposed but not blown out completely. The foreground is better lit and the skin tone looks more pleasing. Oppo has the most overexposure of the sky on the right. The foreground is bright and again overly saturated, which makes the skin look red. Google Pixel and Oppo handled the motion shots confidently, but the X200 Ultra's shakiness only got worse. This is a recurring issue with all Vivo smartphones I've tested, and I hope they eventually resolve it. Let's quickly talk about the specs of our front-facing cameras. The Google Pixel 10 Pro XL has a 42-megapixel module with an f2.2 aperture. The Vivo X200 Ultra is equipped with a 50-megapixel front camera with an f2.45 aperture. As for the Oppo Find X8 Ultra, it's equipped with a 32-megapixel camera with an aperture of f2.4. Now on the Pixel, I've enabled HDR and 4K at 30 frames per second. On the Vivo, I've enabled Dolby Vision. This is the picture we get with Dolby Vision. And on the Oppo, I've enabled the HDR effect. When it comes to HDR, we're most interested in the results when shooting against the light. And here again, the Pixel 10 Pro XL performed more confidently than its competitors. The sky looks good. There's less flare around the sun compared to the others. The foreground is quite saturated and contrasty. The Vivo has a more overexposed sky. Oppo is completely off. However, both lack contrast significantly, which makes the video appear flat. Now let's do a video portrait on the Vivo and Oppo. Unfortunately, we can't shoot videos with background blur on the Google Pixel's front-facing camera. Of course, the lack of portrait mode on the front camera in 2025 is definitely a drawback for a flagship. But we have what we have. Vivo and Oppo handle the blur quite neatly, although sometimes minor errors appear at the edges of the blur around the hair and ears. Sadly, the stabilization issue persists in this mode on the X200 Ultra too. Even when walking, we see the camera shake, and when I rotate the smartphone around myself, the video noticeably jitters. It's as if the smartphone is dropping frames. Both Vivo and Oppo didn't handle stabilization confidently in portrait mode. The background shakes quite a bit on both. Friends, this is how smartphones record sound in quite challenging conditions. There's road noise behind me here, lots of cars, and the sound is reflected off the fences and returns to the camera. It's very interesting to see how our smartphones will perform with this noisy road. Cars moving fast and being so close, really close. To achieve voice isolation on the Google Pixel 10 Pro XL, I need to set it to 4K at 30 frames per second. Unfortunately, the Google Pixel 10 Pro XL can't currently record in 4K at 60 frames per second. Now I've enabled voice enhancement on the Vivo X200 Ultra. And now I'm enabling it on the Oppo Find X8 Ultra. And this is how my voice sounds in quite challenging conditions, showing how our smartphones handle things when there's noisy traffic nearby. In normal mode, all the flagships did quite well. My voice was clearly audible even in such challenging conditions. With voice enhancement enabled, the background noise remained as is on the Pixel. On the Vivo X200 Ultra, however, the voice sounded somewhat compressed. But the result on the Oppo was actually very good. The voice is clear and the volume of background noise is noticeably reduced. Let's switch to the main camera block and record everything around us with the ultra-wide lens. It's immediately noticeable that the details are better processed on the left and center, for example the grass, whereas on the Oppo it's quite blurry on the right. There are also differences in color reproduction. The Pixel video is the brightest, coolest with a blue sky. Vivo and Oppo produce a darker, more contrasty image and a saturated blue sky. All three cameras handle the backlighting well. There's almost no flare from the sun, though of course it's already sunset here. And the test wasn't the most challenging. All the smartphones hold stabilization well. Google and Oppo perform confidently despite their side-mounted position on the tripod. When filming yourself, the X200 Ultra delivered the most balanced result. It has good, vibrant picture quality, a fairly bright yet simultaneously contrasting foreground, normal skin tones, and the best detail rendering out of the three. The Pixel's foreground is very washed out and the hair, facial details, and clothing are blurry. Sometimes, for example, wrinkles on the forehead completely disappear. The Oppo Find X8 Ultra's detail also doesn't quite reach the level of the Vivo. Like for instance, you can barely see the stubble. At the same time, the foreground is incredibly dark. All three images in the stabilization test turned out even. Now I'm shooting everything around me with the main lens. The main difference is the zoom level on the Vivo. Its main lens is 35mm. We also see a difference in color reproduction, but I won't focus on that in as much detail. As for image quality, it's difficult to assess the difference right now. Let's take a closer look at it in the video zoom test. All three performed well with stabilization. The videos are quite smooth with no major jerks or shakes. When shooting selfies, the main camera on the X200 Ultra delivers the most detailed and sharp result. This is partly due to its higher zoom level. Google Pixel and Oppo are on par in terms of detail. Regarding color reproduction when shooting against the light, we get a picture that's roughly the same as what we see on the ultra-wides. The Pixel looks washed out, while the Oppo gives a dark foreground, whereas the Vivo delivers a balanced result. When shooting with the light, the situation changes. The skin tone on the left becomes slightly more saturated, though it's still quite pale. The skin tone came out yellowish in the center, more balanced on the right. Also, when scrolling, we see the X200 Ultra experiencing problems with image smoothness again. The stabilization worked equally well on all devices, no issues there. Let's move on. Just for fun, I filmed everything around at 2x zoom. The Vivo produced the most detailed image. That makes sense. It has a crop of only 0.5x from the main camera. Oppo and Pixel have a crop of twice that, which is why the image doesn't look as sharp. However, if you look closely at the details, like the grass, you can see that Oppo's result is the most blurry. Stabilization is as expected. Vivo holds up better thanks to its central position on the tripod. The side shake in the video is more pronounced, and on the Pixel, you can even notice the jelly effect. With enhanced stabilization, Google can only record in Full HD and with the 1x and 2x lens. Vivo can do this in 0.6x in 2.8K at 60 frames per second. Oppo doesn't really have that mode. It does have a kind of enhanced stabilization, but I don't think it's quite the same. The ultra-wide on the Vivo worked really well. The Pixel, of course, has a rather sad result. As for the Oppo, I don't even want to talk about it. The picture is just wobbling. On the main lens, the X200 Ultra still outperforms its competitors, especially when shaken from side to side. There's no stabilization whatsoever on the left and right. Meanwhile, Vivo delivers a quite confident result. The situation remains unchanged at 2x zoom. Vivo doesn't even give Pixel and Oppo a chance when shaken from side to side. Here's what the video looks like with background blur effect. On Google, my blur setting is at 75. On the Vivo X200 Ultra, it's 4K 30 frames per second. This is the 0.6x ultra-wide lens. And on the Oppo, I also have a 1x lens at Full HD 30 frames per second. f2.8 blur. Meaning it's the same as on the Vivo, meaning they have the same blur applied now. Pixel perhaps has the weakest portrait mode of these three. Firstly, only it caught the blur, and 24 FPS, of course, looks unpleasant. Vivo and Oppo didn't have noticeable focus issues. The videos are smooth and the blur boundary holds neatly. Although, all three experience some challenges with my fringe at times. I praise Vivo for including portrait mode on the ultra-wide lens. They likely realized it wouldn't be as convenient to shoot portraits at 1.5x zoom. The stabilization is steady on the 10 Pro XL and Vivo X200 Ultra. The background, however, shakes quite a bit on the Oppo. Okay, and now it's the same thing except I put 1.5x zoom on the Vivo, the main lens with the background blur effect. Overall, if you meet a close-up, the 1.5x zoom on the Vivo works well. The video looks good. Nothing changed during the running test. So, let's move on to the next test. Now let's look at a tracking shot in portrait mode. The Pixel's Full HD at 24 frames, of course, looks very weak. I don't think that's the level of a top-tier flagship from 2025. When rotating, all three smartphones blur protruding hairs separately. But otherwise, there are no noticeable major mistakes around the blur edge. Now we're shooting with the main lens. Yes, and here, generally, everything is the same. I won't repeat myself. Let's move on to 8K recording. It's only available on the Pixel and Vivo with the ultra-wide lens. Of course, how Google implemented 8K is a whole separate story. The video is shot in two files, Full HD and 4K, and they are then processed and converted to 8K when uploaded to Google Photos, like a pumpkin into a carriage. It doesn't work as magically as one might hope though. 8K files take a very, very long time to create. They require space on your personal Google Drive, and then they won't even open on your PC or in Premiere Pro. So you have to convert them again using the third-party program, the most ridiculous 8K implementation I've ever seen. As for image quality, the result on the left and in the center are almost identical. To the right, the image looks softer, more blurry, but we saw that in our 4K test earlier too. In the stabilization test, the Google Pixel holds the steadiest. I have to give it credit. The Vivo has more shake, and the Oppo shows a jelly effect. When shooting selfies in 8K, the Pixel and Vivo appear more detailed and sharper than the image from the Oppo. This is noticeable, for example, in the way hair or the grass in the background looks. In the video stabilization test, the footage on the left and center looks neat and smooth. At the same time, on the right we see jitter and blur. Let's see how smoothly our smartphones switch between lenses. We'll start with the Google Pixel. The transition from the ultra-wide to the main lens is quite smooth in terms of color, but the change in focal length is quite noticeable. However, when switching to the telephoto lens, there's a very strong jump in white balance. When zooming in quickly, this jump is also noticeable. The transition to the main lens is smooth on the Vivo. The white balance shifts slightly. The same applies when switching to the telephoto lens. The color changes, but only slightly, and this is almost unnoticeable when zooming in quickly. The transition to the main lens on the Oppo is quite abrupt. The image noticeably becomes paler. The difference becomes even more noticeable when switching to the 3x telephoto lens. However, when switching to the second 6x telephoto lens, the change in white balance isn't as apparent. Color shifts are also quite noticeable during fast zoom. Now let's compare the zoom range in video mode. It's important to mention the camera specifications here. The Pixel 10 Pro XL has a 48 megapixels f1.7 ultra-wide lens with a 13mm focal length. The main camera is 50 megapixel f1.68 and a 5x telephoto lens at 48 megapixels f2.8. The Vivo has a 50 megapixel ultra-wide lens with an f2.0 aperture and a 14mm focal length. The main camera is also 50 megapixels with an f1.69 aperture. And of course, a powerful 3.7x 200 megapixel telephoto lens with an f2.27 aperture. The Oppo Find X8 Ultra is equipped with a 50 megapixel f2.0 ultra-wide camera with a 15mm focal length. The main camera is 50 megapixel f1.8. There are two telephoto lenses here. The first is a 3x zoom, 50 megapixel f2.1, and the second is a 6x zoom, also 50 megapixel with an aperture of f3.1. Now let's move on to the tests themselves. The ultra-wide lens delivers the best results with Oppo. Notice the purple banner at the bottom. The text on it is the most legible specifically on the Find X8 Ultra. Vivo outperformed everyone in video from the main camera. Text readability is clearly better than with Pixel and Oppo, which isn't surprising because the X200 Ultra has a 1.5x main camera while competitors have 1x. Let's move on. We get telephoto lenses on the Oppo and Vivo. The Pixel has a 3x digital zoom, and we immediately notice that the Pixel's result is unusable. Poor readability and a lot of noise. And on top of that, the image is shaky. Simply put, it's a disaster. The Vivo and Oppo, however, deliver a good level of detail. Next up, 5x zoom on the Pixel and Vivo and 6x zoom on the Oppo, and here the picture quality is generally very similar. Let's look at the 10x zoom. The X200 Ultra doesn't give its competitors a chance. Its fine print is legible, something the others can't boast. At 20x zoom, Vivo performs the best. You can make out a phone number, the Oppo image is slightly less sharp, and with the Pixel, we're getting a confusing mess. Let's enable 30x on the Find X8 Ultra, and we can still make out the writing. Let's enable 8K on the Vivo and Google Pixel. On the ultra-wide, the detail level is pretty comparable, but on the main lens, the 10 Pro XL and X200 Ultra clearly outperform Oppo in terms of detail. Their text looks sharper and clearer. 5 times zoom on the Pixel compared to 6 times on the Oppo, the text on the Pixel appears blurry. The X200 Ultra and Find X8 Ultra are roughly on the same level though. There are no issues here. Now let's see how our flagships perform in HDR and logarithmic shooting modes. And of course, the results with SDR, standard dynamic range. We're starting with the ultra-wide. In regular shooting with the Vivo X200 Ultra, we see a wider dynamic range. The highlights from the sun are minimal, while the foreground remains bright and well detailed. The image from Vivo is more saturated, warmer, and brighter. The image on the Oppo, however, fluctuates noticeably. It feels like in professional mode where we recorded, stabilization is completely disabled, so I wouldn't advise shooting handheld in that mode. Now let's move on to the expanded dynamic range mode. On the sides, we have HDR, and to the right, Dolby Vision. Let me remind you, this is a type of HDR which is supposed to give greater color depth. It's immediately noticeable that all three images have become brighter. In highlight situations, everything remains unchanged. Vivo performs better than its competitors. Let's enable the logarithmic profile. The situation is actually quite sad. Vivo's sky is practically non-existent, and Oppo's image looks dull and washed out. It's completely lacking expression. Let's switch to the main lenses. I can say that Vivo and Oppo are roughly on par in terms of dynamic range. The Pixel, however, is a bit weaker. Also, the image on the 10 Pro XL is too dull, and just look at the grass. It's completely gray here. When switching to HDR video on the Pixel, it became more saturated, but it's still noticeably duller than the competition's. On the Vivo and Oppo, the video became slightly warmer, but we don't see any significant differences from HDR. Now let's enable the logarithmic profile on the Vivo and Oppo and enhanced video mode on the Google Pixel. Clearly, the footage from the Find X8 Ultra looks the worst here. It's dark, overexposed, and the colors are unnatural. The situation is slightly better on the X200 Ultra, but the sky is blown out and the picture is washed out. The colors on the Pixel are also quite bland, but at least the sky looks decent. Overall, I can say that shooting in HDR really makes sense on each of the smartphones. However, the logarithmic profile with amateur color grading gives a very weak result. I really liked the enhanced video mode on the Pixel, especially on the ultra-wide lens. Now let's move on to the time-lapse test. All the smartphones in this test allow you to record video in 4K. However, it's noticeable that the Oppo has less detail compared to Google Pixel and Vivo. The X200 Ultra produced the brightest and most vibrant result. It looks great. The Oppo has calmer colors and lower brightness. The 10 Pro XL has the darkest and least expressive time-lapse. Now let's see how our flagships handle slow-motion video recording. I'm shooting in 120 FPS now. The main lenses are on the sides, and the ultra-wide is in the center. Google can only record in full HD here, but the competitors output 4K. Their footage is more detailed and vibrant. Let's enable the main lens on the Vivo as well. The results are the same. We also filmed video at 240 FPS in full HD on all the smartphones. The results are similar, but the Pixel once again produced a paler image. By the way, the Google Pixel has an interesting video recording mode that competitors don't have. It's called Cinematic Pan. Using it, we get slow-motion video with a blurred background and focus solely on the subject being filmed. Now let's shoot some macro video. On the Google Pixel, we're enabling macro focus in auto mode. Macro photo and macro video recording is done on the main lens, while Vivo and Oppo record macro video on the telephoto lens. The video on all three smartphones turned out to be quite good. You can make out the tiniest details of our cockroach. However, of course, the macro video looks weaker on the Pixel compared to its competitors. More noise, a less smooth picture, not such sharp details. We're done with the video recording tests. Now we're testing the photo mode. Let's start as always with selfies. In the first shot against the light, all three smartphones produced a very detailed result. By the way, the Pixel has the widest viewing angle, and a wide-angle front camera is always a plus. But the main difference is color reproduction. The Pixel's photo turned out to be the darkest and most contrasty. Skin tones appear pinkish. The skin tone looks a bit yellow with Vivo, quite saturated. The photos overall are the brightest and least contrasty. Oppo's results are a bit paler, darker, and more contrasty than the X200 Ultras. The skin tone is less yellow, even leaning towards an orange hue. And from here, it all depends on which color you personally find more interesting. In the second shot, all three produced a quite detailed and good result. There's only a slight difference in color reproduction. The Pixel delivers a more natural image, while Vivo and Oppo show the characteristic processing common to most Chinese flagships. Next up, we have a portrait shot. And then, all three photos turned out completely different. The 10 Pro XL noticeably yellows the image, with an orange skin tone. Vivo, on the other hand, shows an overexposed image and low contrast, which results in a whitish-looking shot. Oppo, however, gives a good result. There's really nothing to complain about here. The blur on all these flagships turns out to be high quality, without any obvious errors on the edges. Next shot. Here, Vivo shifted the skin tone to an overtly orange hue. Oppo made the skin tone red, and only Pixel gave a more or less natural color. The detail is a bit better on the X200 Ultra. You can see it in the hair and bristles. Regarding blurring, there are questions for all the flagships. The left side has smudged ear, and parts of the hair are blurred in the center and on the right. Here's the final shot. The skin tone looks most natural on the Vivo, while the competitors push the photo towards an orange hue. In terms of detail, the X200 Ultra once again outperformed its rivals. Again, let's look at the stubble. By the way, it's worth noting again that the Pixel's wide-angle front-facing camera is a definite plus. Now let's take photos of people using the main camera block. We're shooting everything in automatic mode and with the same settings that the smartphones offer out of the box. The Vivo has a vivid, saturated color profile. It's important to note that if you don't like the saturation on the X200 Ultra, or on any other Vivo phone for that matter, you can always choose a different profile, like Zeiss. It's hard to see a difference in detail on the ultra-wide lenses, so let's focus on colors and how they handle sunlight. It's immediately noticeable that Oppo did the worst job with backlighting. The image looks like it's covered in haze. Vivo produces the most saturated images, with an orange skin tone. There's also a slight haze effect visible. The Pixel captured a less saturated image, but without the haze. Furthermore, the Google smartphone handled flares the best. Now let's look at the main lenses. Here, the haze is most noticeable in the center of the image. Lens flares are now only visible on the 10 Pro XL and Find X8 Ultra. Everything else is the same as with the ultra-wide lenses. Now let's switch to the telephoto lenses. Google Pixel performed best in terms of color here. There's almost no sun flare. Skin tones are natural. On the Vivo, the image shifts towards purple hues and is veiled again. A similar situation is seen on the Oppo. Also due to the proper handling of light, the 10 Pro XL also outperformed the competition in terms of detail. Look at my hair, for example. Next, we switch to 7.4x on the Vivo and 6x on the Oppo. On the Pixel, we'll leave it at 5x. On the X200 Ultra, there are no color changes, but the level of detail is clearly improved. Look at the stubble, for example. The Oppo produced the weakest image. The tint turned yellowish green and the details are blurred. Let's zoom in 10x. Here, with the Vivo, the color is just a disaster. You can see it yourself. However, the level of detail is the best here. There are no differences on the Oppo compared to the 6X. The Pixel produced a yellowish skin tone and the weakest level of detail. But once again, it handled the sun better than its competitors, creating a clean shot without any film effect or filter. At your request, we also took a photo on the Vivo using the Zeiss color profile, which should ideally be less saturated than vivid. On the ultra-wide lens, we only see differences in color reproduction. Google produced the most muted and darkest image. This is especially noticeable in the grass. However, the skin tones look quite natural on it. Vivo and Oppo delivered similar images, more saturated than on the Pixel. We don't see any differences in dynamic range or detail. They all performed well. On the main lenses, skin tones on the 10 Pro XL started to skew red, and the image itself became even darker. On the Find X8 Ultra, there were no changes. The photos from the X200 Ultra are the most saturated, and skin tones appear yellowish. In terms of dynamic range, Vivo performs slightly worse than the competitors, slightly overexposing the sky. There are no differences in detail. Next, we enable 2x zoom on the Google and the telephoto lens on the Vivo and Oppo. The photo from the Pixel again has a reddish tinge. This is visible both in the face and in the sky in the background. The Oppo photo is warmer, with a natural skin tone. The Vivo photo is again the most saturated and warm, with a yellowish skin tone. In terms of detail, Google performs slightly worse than its competitors on the eyebrows, eyelashes, and facial details. Vivo and Oppo have performed similarly here. All three smartphones did well in dynamic range. Let's move on. 5x on the 10 Pro XL, 7.4x on the X200 Ultra, and 6x on the Find X8 Ultra. The Pixel now delivers a warm image just like the competitors. Overall, there are no noticeable differences in color reproduction and skin tone, although the image on the Oppo seems slightly overexposed. In terms of detail, Vivo is leading. This is noticeable, for example, in the eyebrows, eyelashes, and facial details. Pixel and Oppo perform similarly here. Now let's move to 10x zoom. Again, there are no significant differences in skin tone and color reproduction. The X200 Ultra handles detail better. The 10 Pro XL heavily smooths out the image, and the photo from the X8 Ultra is downright blurry. You can see this, for example, in the hair. Switching to portrait mode, the photos from the main lens turned out to be quite similar. My only observation is that the Find X8 Ultra shifts the skin tone towards a pinkish hue. Next photo. Here, Vivo somehow decided to make my wonderful wife and daughter's hair a bit lighter. Otherwise, the photos are virtually identical. Overall, this trend continues across all the other zoom levels. It's sad, of course, that the maximum for the Pixel 10 Pro XL 3x portrait mode is that. Let's move on to the next mini photo shoot with my daughter Masha. And here, you can say the same thing for all the shots. The Pixel photos come out dark, faces are heavily smoothed, and the detail is low. I don't even want to talk about the blur, it's quite rough. Just look at what happens above the hair. It looks like a staircase of background peeking through the blur. In contrast, Vivo and Oppo deliver excellent shots with very beautiful and refined blurring. Let's move on to our fork and spoon test, where we see how smartphones perform with small objects in portrait mode. On lower zoom levels, the smartphones did well, and both the fork and the pasta always remain in focus. It's worth noting here that you can see pixelation around the highlights on the Pixel, while Vivo and Oppo handle it flawlessly. Now let's take a look at the 5.9x on the X200 Ultra and the 6x on the Find X8 Ultra. The Vivo one turned out excellent, but the highlights are a little blurred. With Oppo, we see the same problem with the highlights, but to that is added a blurriness of the macaroni shape as well. The straw test was handled flawlessly by all the flagships. Now, let's take a look at the most delicious photos. The X200 Ultra has a dedicated mode where we can choose from a wide variety of photo styles, and the Find X8 Ultra also offers a large number of different filters. Here, it's noticeable that all the smartphones have different color reproduction and focusing. Overall, of course, all the photos look beautiful and very appealing. It really comes down to personal taste. Some people prefer the softer, more natural shots from the Pixel, while others like the vibrant, Instagram-worthy shots from Vivo and Oppo. Let's move on to the photo zoom test. We'll start, as usual, with the ultra-wide lens. All three smartphones offer similar quality and detail, but Oppo, for example, this text is considered better, although it's possible that's due to its higher zoom level than the competitors. Now, let's look at the main lenses. Again, there are no significant differences in detail. The only thing I can note is that the brick texture isn't as well rendered on the Pixel. Also, the text isn't as readable as it is on the competitors. 2x zoom. Here, the images are also roughly the same in terms of detail. I can note some nuances. The 10 Pro XL has a more refined contour of the upper text compared to its competitors. The Vivo shows more pronounced pixelation, and the Oppo has noticeable letter distortions. We're enabling the telephoto lenses on all the smartphones. The zoom levels are slightly different, and of course, the Pixel has an advantage here. 5x optical zoom delivers excellent results, and we can easily read even small text. The Vivo and Oppo devices have blurrier lettering. Next up is Vivo's 7.4x zoom magnification. At this zoom level, all the details are well preserved and small text is readable without any issues. Let's activate 10x zoom on all the smartphones. You can see that the colors are rendered more accurately on the left and right. As for detail, the result is more or less the same. Now, 30x zoom. Here, all the smartphones actively add details to the photos, and it's very noticeable, especially in the text. Overall, the letters are legible in each image, but they are quite distorted. It's just that each one does it a little differently. I'm enabling the maximum zoom available on each device. Small text is unreadable on all of them. The Pixel and Oppo turned it into scribbles, while Vivo blurred it. The large text turned out to be the clearest on the left, but some of the letters are still drawn incorrectly. The letters in the center and on the right of the photo aren't as even or sharp, but they are at least correct. Now let's shoot everything around us, and we'll start with the ultra-wide lens. The Oppo Find X8 consistently produces the most saturated images. Vivo's colors are a bit more subdued, although that varies from shot to shot. The Pixel delivers a mostly neutral color in almost all photos, without exaggerated hues, but even it sometimes produces a saturated result. There's a difference in exposure and white balance. And again, it all comes down to your personal preferences. Photos from the main cameras on all smartphones look good, and again, everyone chooses what color rendition suits them best. Now let's look at photos taken with the telephoto lenses. Google delivered the most saturated and warm image, and also handled the sunlight best, while our competitors show lens flares at the top of the shots. Moving on to raw shooting. Let me remind you that this produces a photo that is saved directly from the camera's sensor, so we can get the maximum dynamic range and color grade these frames ourselves. I can say that these flagships handle daytime raw photos with ease. No overexposure or noise. Everything turns out beautifully and neatly. The source material comes out quite good, allowing you to color grade it to your liking. Regarding detail, if you look closely, you'll notice that the Pixel loses detail and shadows in places. Pay attention to the foliage and grass here. Let's move on to macro photography, and I'm going to talk about how it's implemented in these smartphones. The Pixel calls this mode macro focus. It works within a range of 1x to 5x. When attempting to use other zoom levels, the Pixel's macro mode simply turns off. Vivo calls this mode super macro, and when enabled, the smartphone switches to the telephoto lens. It's great that the device suggests how best to take a picture and tells us move back further. We can zoom in up to 20x. When the macro mode is activated, the Find X8 Ultra switches to the 3x telephoto lens. We can choose between two focus options, natural bokeh or full focus. With this, in macro mode, you can zoom all the way up to 30x. I can say that Vivo and Oppo have set a high bar and confidently maintain it. The footage looks very beautiful and is of the highest quality. Pixel, however, is quite sad. The photos are blurry, and clearly they are lacking in detail compared to the competition. Let's see what features the smartphone cameras offer us. The Pixel has modes that aren't available on Vivo and Oppo. Let's start with Add Me. Let's take a picture. Let's move to the side. Let's take a second one. Let's combine them. And here in the photos, we see our double. A cool mode. And lastly, the panorama mode. We've already looked at a similar one in video mode. Using it, we get photos with a blurred background and focus only on the subject being photographed. All three smartphones allow for underwater shooting. Vivo and Oppo have special modes for that. Upon activation, the touch controls are disabled for ease of use. Only mechanical controls remain, using the volume and power buttons. The smartphones also warn that they are not designed for diving, and that waterproof cases should be used when operating at depths greater than the permitted level or for longer than the recommended time. The The Pixel doesn't have a special mode for underwater shooting. Vivo and Oppo give us the ability to capture live photos. We get a slightly slowed down mini video. The Pixel doesn't have such a mode at all. Now we're taking instant shots. The Google Pixel doesn't have that mode, so we'll just take a regular photo. On the Vivo, we'll use the instant snapshot mode. On the Oppo, the sports mode. Obviously, the photo on the left is the most blurry. The photo in the center is the sharpest. The photo on the right also gives a quite clear result. Now we're doing a burst of photos. Pixel disappoints again, not allowing us to shoot in that mode. So we're just taking photos in motion. Serial shooting on the Vivo involves holding down the shutter button in photo mode. Oppo uses a sports mode. Surprisingly, Vivo performed the worst here. Water droplets are blurred. The clearest results are on the Oppo, slightly worse on the Google Pixel. Friends, night has fallen. And now we'll test the photo and video capabilities in low light conditions. Our first test, as tradition dictates, is a front-facing camera. This is a 4K 30fps front-facing camera recording. So, I chose the brightest street possible. Ideally, the light should illuminate my face well here. By the way, Oppo has the fill light turned on. The Vivo X200 Ultra is once again inferior in stabilization compared to its rivals, despite being centered on the tripod. The X200 Ultra also has a rather unpleasant yellowish skin tone. The skin looks a bit better on the left and right. However, of course, it's important to consider that in low light, a lot depends on the surrounding light sources. I also noticed Oppo's tendency to soften the image at every step. Clearly, in these conditions, the front camera doesn't hold stabilization very confidently. The most stable result in this test is on the left with the Google Pixel. When shooting against the light, the Vivo yellows skin even more. The Pixel's color is pink, while the Oppo gives a result somewhere in between those two. During a run, the 10 Pro XL and Find X8 Ultra perform unsteadily and wobble roughly the same. But the Vivo still has the most shake. Okay, and now I'm switching to 4K 60fps. Well, I'm not really liking the image quality on the Vivo. It's trying to like the whole image, but my face is completely overexposed. Now I'll tap on my face. Okay, and lower the exposure just a bit like that. It turns out that when I manually lower the exposure, the picture at least looks somewhat normal. Of course, all videos look smoother in 60fps. It's noticeable that when walking against the background, the light sources are no longer blurred for any of the three. Has the stabilization improved? Let's check now. The image has definitely become smoother when running on the Pixel 10 Pro XL, and the stabilization here is the most confident of all three. The shake is just as intense on Vivo and Oppo, but at least the X200 Ultra doesn't have any smearing, unlike the X8 Ultra. Alright, and now let's try video portrait mode. The front-facing camera on the Vivo X200 Ultra shoots Full HD at 30fps. Oppo also shoots Full HD at 30fps. On the Google Pixel, I just set it to Full HD at 30fps. Unfortunately, Google's Pixel doesn't have the option to record video with background blur on the front-facing camera. Portrait video looks decent for these shooting conditions. However, something strange is happening with the light on Vivo. The color of the ambient light doesn't change, but the color reproduction on the X200 Ultra sometimes turns yellowish-green, then returns to normal. Oppo's result is still more stable, so we'll consider it the winner in this test. Although, when it comes to stabilization, both of these smartphones shake equally when running. Now we're shooting everything with the ultra-wide lens. The results are quite different. The Pixel's image is pale, with strong flares from the streetlights, but the detail is decent when looking at the tiles. The Vivo offers the most saturated, sharp, and clear image. The Oppo has the weakest detail, judging by the tiles and grass. And the color is quite warm and slightly less saturated than the X200 Ultra. The Vivo performed well during the running test, but of course, we're keeping in mind that it's in the center of the tripod. Switching to 60fps made all three videos appear slightly paler, but the stabilization became smoother. According to what we're seeing, this happens during the running test. Indeed, all three images hold up quite confidently, although there is some blur. All the smartphones shoot 4K at 30fps with the ultra-wide lens. Now it's really interesting to see how they perform. Will it be okay, or is there not enough light? Because sometimes, here, some of our streetlights just don't work, and so it seems like there isn't enough light. Hopefully our ultra-wide cameras will pull out a decent image and at least have a more or less acceptable quality. But, by the way, cars are driving by here. Maybe the headlights are affecting me a bit, so maybe it's okay. When filming yourself, it's immediately noticeable that the Google Pixel has a wider angle, which is definitely a plus for it. There's no significant difference in detail between the videos. The main difference is in color reproduction. The video on the left is the brightest and palest. Vivo and Oppo produce darker images. At the same time, the X200 Ultra more heavily colored my sweater, whereas Oppo actively tones the skin. The stabilization is the same as when shooting the surrounding environment. The side smartphones clearly lose to Vivo here. At 60 FPS, all three videos became less clear and sharp. Overall, the result was quite strange. The image on the Pixel flickers noticeably, and it has also become paler and darker. The Vivo produced an even yellower skin tone, but overall, the image is the most natural of all. The Oppo video became too dark. The stabilization has become smoother. But what's the point if our videos look like this? Let's switch to the main lenses and film everything around. When it comes to detail, the Pixel and Vivo look roughly the same. The Oppo, however, has less refined grass and tiles. Also, the X200 Ultra noticeably has more camera shake than its competitors. Other differences include a different white balance, and that's about it. The X8 Ultra performed the smoothest during the shake test. Vivo shows more noticeable shaking, and the Pixel shaking is compounded by blur. Let's enable 60 FPS. Here, we can't see any difference in detail between the Oppo and its competitors. While running, the picture on the left and right looks more or less normal for these conditions, whereas the video in the center wobbles and blurs even more. When filming ourselves, we got three very different results. The Pixel video is blurry, and there's almost no shot where I'm in focus. It's physically difficult to watch. Vivo has a greenish skin tone. Apparently, Oppo performed best in this test. It has a better skin tone and there's no smearing or drop frames. But, by the way, all three devices handled the stabilization test perfectly. There's no noticeable shake and the background remains steady everywhere. We're seeing flickering in the video from the 10 Pro XL again at 60 FPS, but at least the motion blur isn't as severe anymore. Vivo's skin tones no longer appear yellowish green. Oppo's image quality was already quite good. Here, the picture simply became smoother. There aren't any noticeable changes in the stabilization test. The image remains as smooth on the left and right as it was before. At the same time, the background shake is more noticeable on the X200 Ultra than on the competitors. I enable 8K on the 10 Pro XL and Vivo on the ultra-wide lenses. Both images look more detailed and sharper than the video from the Find X8 Ultra. However, the same situation was observed in 4K, so it's not necessarily about the higher resolution. All three smartphones shake and blur the image while moving. But of course, the Oppo performs the worst. I can't say that shooting in 8K gives a significant advantage in terms of detail. However, definitely on the left and center there's less noise than in the video on the right. The stabilization situation is the same as when shooting everything around. Vivo and Pixel hold the image fairly well, while Oppo's image is shaky. Now we're testing video recording with background blur on the main lenses. But on the Google we have 1x, on the Vivo we have 0.6x, and on the Oppo we have 1x. What can I say here? Pixel's portrait video looks normal, but occasionally there's a blur in the foreground. And again, a dislike for 24 FPS. Of course, the image looks smoother on the competitors. Vivo's video is smoother, with almost no blur. There are no issues regarding blur and smoothness. The main drawback here is the overexposed pale yellow face. All three handled the stabilization test well, but Vivo's result is of course the most stable. Thanks to the centered positioning, 1.5x on Vivo. Of course, the main lens provides higher sharpness and detail compared to the ultra-wide. The video looks good, and the main camera stabilization works excellently. There's not much more to say about that really. Now, the most challenging portrait test. A pass around a person and in low light to boot. The blurring is consistent across all smartphones, but there are nuances. When zooming out with the ultra-wide lens on the Vivo, it loses detail significantly, and faces look very bad. The Oppo stabilization is disappointing. The video is constantly shaky. The Pixel doesn't have these problems, but there's a slight softness. We switch to the main lens on the Vivo, and theoretically, we should get a better result. But, alas. Throughout the entire recording, my face remains blurred, while our competitors' faces are in focus. Now, let's move on to the video zoom test in low light. On the ultra-wide, the Pixel 10 Pro XL delivers the weakest result. We can see that the tile is the most blurred, and the sign is the most overexposed. At the same time, Vivo and Oppo have very similar results. The same issues appear in the video recorded with the main camera. The Pixel loses the most detail and overexposes the sign, while the X200 Ultra and X8 Ultra offer comparable detail. The only nuance is that we see more noise in the center than to the left and right. Generally, I want to note that the exposure on the Pixel works strangely. It illuminates the foreground well, but signs remain blown out. If you adjust the exposure for the signs, the foreground becomes very dark. We observed a similar situation in our recent comparison of the Google Pixel 10 Pro XL with the 9th and 8th generations. If you haven't watched this video yet, be sure to check it out. As always, we're leaving the link in the video description. At 2x zoom, Vivo still has the noisiest video, but it's also the best quality. Here, we can at least make out the text. To the left, the display is completely overexposed, and to the right, everything is blurry. The 3x digital zoom on the Pixel activates the first telephoto lens on the Oppo. We're also engaging the 3.7x telephoto lens on the X200 Ultra. And of course, Vivo doesn't give its competitors a chance here. At 5x zoom, the Pixel activates its telephoto lens, while the others use digital zoom. Even under these conditions, the Pixel produces the most overexposed and weakest result, while the Vivo delivers the sharpest and most detailed. Oppo's video is better than the 10 Pro XL, but worse than the X200 Ultra. All models, except the X8 Ultra, have a 10x digital zoom. It uses a hybrid zoom. A second telephoto lens with 6x crop has been activated. And what's interesting is that both it and the Pixel consider small text better than Vivo. Let's enable 20x. I tried manually reducing the video exposure to better reveal bright areas. Oppo surprised me here. It constantly reset my setting and pulled the slider back up, sometimes even while I was pulling it down. At the same time, Vivo and Pixel were accurately capturing the exposure I set without any issues. The result on the left and in the center is almost identical. The sign is readable, but the video itself is very dark. The sign on the right is overexposed. On the Oppo, we're zooming in at 30x. And here, everything is perfectly readable. There's no overexposure. There's some image shake appearing though. Now let's see if shooting in 8K is worth it. In terms of detail, Google Pixel hasn't made any progress compared to 4K video. The tile is still blurry, but the inscription isn't as overexposed. Vivo doesn't show any changes at all in 8K. I'm enabling 8K on the main lens of the 10 Pro XL. And even here, I can't say the detail is significantly better than the competition's. I'll just note that there's less noise. And finally, 8K at a 5x zoom. Again, the Pixel has the least noise. If you compare it to 4K, the signs are less overexposed, yet Vivo still handles light sources better. Night video recording is done, now let's do photos. Let's start as always with selfies. And the first photo generally looks clear and detailed on all three smartphones. What's cool is that Oppo automatically turns on face illumination when taking selfies in low light. That's convenient. Thanks to it, Oppo revealed details under the eyebrows and around the eyes, which its competitors failed to do, leaving those areas very dark. Vivo, as usual, gives us a yellowish skin tone, and Pixel gives a pinkish one. I took a selfie with my daughter. Oppo did the best in terms of sharpness. Take a look, for example, at my beard. Google offers a more pleasing skin tone, while the competitors' images are overly bright. Pixel handled noise reduction best. Vivo performed the worst. Now I'm taking portrait selfies. It's noticeable that the photo quality has worsened in all smartphones. They try to compensate for this with sharpness and algorithms. All three fail to blur the background behind me. The Pixel and Vivo show unblurred areas above my head. With the Oppo, the same problem is visible to the left of my head. The Pixel this time produced the most saturated, almost tan skin tone. The Vivo photo is very pale. The Oppo skin color looks the most balanced. The photo is blurry, as if the smartphone couldn't focus. I took a photo with my daughters. The Vivo produced the clearest result. However, the skin tone rendering wasn't as good as its competitors. Faces appear yellowish. The Google Pixel also adds a yellowish tint. The Oppo delivers the most natural skin tone. Furthermore, only it preserved the blush on my daughter's cheeks. Everyone performed poorly with the blur effect. On the left, part of my hairline is blurred, while in the center and on the right, there are issues with my daughter's hair. I can also add to the Pixel's strengths a wider viewing angle than the competitors. Now we're taking regular photos of people using the main camera block. It's difficult to assess the difference between the wide-angle shots. On the main lenses, the photos on the left and right are contrasty and quite dark. At the same time, Vivo produces a bright result. The X200 Ultra, as usual, prioritizes the person in the frame and adjusts the exposure to ensure their face is well lit. A similar story unfolds on the next zoom level. However, Oppo has also raised the exposure here and brightened the face well. The 10 Pro XL has the darkest image and the weakest quality. You can see that, for example, my face and fingers have been heavily edited by algorithms and look as if they're made of clay. 5x on Google, 7.4x on Vivo, and 6x on Oppo. Here, the photo on the Pixel looks better than it did on the previous zoom. The photo in the center is too bright and washed out, and the work of the algorithms is very noticeable in the foreground. Oppo's shot is the weakest, it exhibits blur again. It also produces the palest and most overexposed result. 10x zoom. On the left, a noisy photo. In the center, aggressive algorithmic enhancements. On the right as well, but with an overexposed and pale face added to that. In another zoom level, 30x. Everything here is the same as above, just multiplied by 3. Let's move on to the second photo session. The Pixel has night mode enabled. The Vivo has a landscape and night scene. The Oppo has night mode. It's difficult to assess the quality of photos on the ultra-wide lens, but if you look closely at the details, you'll see that both the Oppo and the tile and the grass look less sharp, and the streetlights create stronger lens flare. The situation with skin tone is like this. It's slightly pinkish on both sides, but the Pixel has a more saturated look. The Vivo has skin tones that are closer to natural. Let's move on to the main camera. The Pixel gave us a slightly blurry result here. Because of that, we can't really assess the detail. We got the darkest and most contrasty image in terms of color. The Vivo photo is also contrasty, but more exposed. At the zoom level, its result is what I find most interesting. The Oppo photo is too bright, it lacks contrast. Let's enable telephoto lenses on the Oppo and Vivo. The Pixel currently has a 3x digital zoom. You can immediately see that a pleasing optical blur of the background appears in the center and to the right of the photo. However, unfortunately, the X8 Ultra couldn't focus properly and once again gave us the flattest image. The Pixel's result is decent, but it's clear that the algorithms are actively smoothing out facial details. Vivo photos are quite sharp, and the colors are vibrant and contrasty. The skin tone situation is standard. It's pinkish on the left, yellowish in the center, and a balance between those two on the right. On the 5X, the telephoto lens is activated on the 10 Pro XL. And now on the left, we also observe background blur. The snapshot is pleasant, detailed, and sharp. Vivo also looks good in terms of photo quality. Oppo still lacks contrast, and the photo appears blurred in the details. The skin tone hasn't changed, so I won't repeat myself. Next zoom level on Vivo, 7.4x. The Pixel currently shows 5x. We're connecting the Oppo's hybrid zoom. The telephoto lens is 6x with digital zoom up to 7.3x. And all the results look excellent in terms of detail here. But when we zoom in on the image, we see that the Oppo produced a slightly less sharp photo than the competitors. Things get really interesting at 10x. The Pixel's result is very smooth and blurry. The algorithms work very aggressively. And yet, the photo still looks noisy and the background is distorted. Look how bad the pole behind me looks. Vivo's result compared to this is simply excellent. Sharp, crisp. There's more detail on the face. The hair is better defined. Oppo's photo is weaker than the X200 Ultras, but better than the 10 Pro XLs. Now let's move on to portrait photos in low light. Filming my daughters. The first photo, the details and colors are very similar. With the Pixel, you can see some errors around the blur boundary. It just blurred part of the hair. Vivo and Oppo have a different problem. There's noticeable noise in the sky. The next shot repeats all of this, with one exception. The sky becomes noisy on the Pixel too. And in the next zoom levels, we see that the 10 Pro XL is falling behind the competition. The shots are less sharp, with weaker detail, and the face ends up looking a bit dark. Second photo session. Here, the lighting is different. This of course affected the color reproduction in the photos. In terms of blurring and image quality, I still have no complaints. All the photos look good. When we switch to telephoto lenses, it's noticeable that Vivo processes photos more actively and enhances sharpness, whereas Oppo produces a softer result. At the last zoom level, Vivo went too far with the processing and lost the boundary of my nose. It's visible that the tip merges with my cheek. Of course, that shouldn't happen. The X8 Ultra's photo is less sharp here, but there aren't any of these errors either. Let's move on to the photo zoom test. Friends, and we're starting, as usual, with the ultra-wide lens. The Vivo X200 Ultra's lens performs the best. The signs aren't overexposed, they're well readable, and the tiles on the building look the most detailed. The result on the right, from Oppo, was slightly more blurry and overexposed, but the Pixel handled the light source the worst. Let's switch to the main cameras. Here, Vivo again impresses with the best detail rendering and handling of light sources. The text is less readable on the X8 Ultra and 10 Pro XL, but the focal length is also shorter here. The tile on the building on the right is well detailed, and the highlights around the sign aren't critical. However, on the left, the highlights are stronger and the tile texture is blurred in places. 2x zoom. Again, the best result is in the center. The one on the left is more overexposed and blurry, but the one on the right is the weakest. Let's enable the telephoto lenses on the Vivo and Oppo. The Pixel currently has a 3x digital zoom. As expected, the optical lens delivers higher quality results, while the Pixel shows significant overexposure and loss of detail. Now let's enable the 5x telephoto lens on the Google Pixel. The Oppo activates its second telephoto lens with a 6x zoom. The Vivo has a 7.4x digital zoom. The Find X8 Ultra gave us the neatest result. Good detail and clarity. The sign's edges are clean, and there's minimal noise in the details. The Vivo also has good detail, but there's noticeably more noise and pixels there. The 10 Pro XL produced the most overexposed result. Switching to 10x. Zooming in on the banner. The numbers are quite readable on the left, there's virtually no overexposure, and the colors are the most accurate, but there's a lot of noise. Vivo also produced a readable result, but the algorithms aggressively cleaned the photo of noise, and the colors of the banner were rendered incorrectly. And the same text became almost black instead of pink. The X8 Ultra has the weakest shot here. It's impossible to even make out the numbers. Let's zoom in 30x and look at that banner again. Here, Oppo delivered the most detailed shot with fairly clear numbers. Vivo also has a good result, but its photo shows more noise, and the numbers themselves look softer. But the weakest shot is on the left, 60x. Second to last zoom level. Overall, the numbers are calculated across all three photos. However, it's clear that the algorithms work differently. The Pixel tried to smooth out all the imperfections. Because of this, the text appears softened. Vivo's result is a bit rougher, but the numbers look cohesive. At the same time, Oppo produced the most distortion. On the final zoom, the results are roughly the same, and I think the X200 Ultra performs most competently at these zoom levels. Numbers here look the same as they did on lower zoom levels. Pixel, on the other hand, overly smooths the corners, and we get an S instead of the number 5. And Oppo's numbers are distorted too much. These are some interesting results, friends. Now let's take landscape photos in low light. We see the differences in the very first shot with the ultra-wide lens. Vivo delivered the most contrasting and deep result, and handled the lights best. The result was slightly weaker on the left, and Oppo performed the worst with the light sources. The situation changes in the second photo. Now the X Pro XL and X8 Ultra did a good job with the lighting, and we clearly see the playground, whereas it's overexposed in the center shot. All the subsequent photos don't differ significantly from each other. I can note here that Vivo almost always delivers more saturated images. Pixel and Oppo, on the other hand, offer more subdued colors. The images captured with the main lenses are quite similar. The main difference is in white balance and brightness. The Pixel X Pro XL, as a rule, tends to produce relatively dark and warm photographs. Vivo and Oppo produce a cooler and brighter result. However, in low light conditions, it often depends on the light sources nearby, so the results can vary. Now we're taking photos with the telephoto lenses. In the first photos, Vivo performed the best. The image here is the most vibrant. Light sources are preserved. On the Pixel, the photo turned out less saturated, and strong lens flares appeared due to the light. The picture on the Oppo was also a bit pale. The Find X8 Ultra handled the light a bit better than the X Pro XL, but you can still see flares on the light sources. There's no visible difference in detail. Next photo. Here again, in terms of how it handles street lights, the Google Pixel performs the worst. We see just a bright spot where the lamp should be. Vivo and Oppo are fine here. In terms of color reproduction and detail, there are no significant differences. Let's move on to shooting raw photos. Let's start with these sunset shots. Overall, all three smartphones give good results here, and we can color grade them without any issues. The result varies, but if you want, you can achieve the color and brightness that you like. We're doing a basic color grade just to assess the dynamic range of raw files. And here's what happens when night falls. Here, in most of the ultra-wide shots, especially in challenging conditions, the X Pro XL performs admirably. It exhibits the fewest flares from the lights in the background. At the same time, the photos look contrasty, and the sky can be rendered almost black. Vivo also delivers decent results, but flare issues are more frequently noticeable. However, the Oppo Find X8 Ultra produced the weakest raw photos. How about the main lenses? Here too, in most cases, the Pixel allows you to achieve a more impactful result with good contrast and minimal flare. Raw shots were also a strong point on the Pixel 9 Pro XL, and it's pleasing that the new model also performs excellently in these tests. We shot nighttime raw photos and used the telephoto lenses. In terms of how the phones handled light sources, all of them performed poorly in the initial shots. The street lights are blown out, and there are lens flares. The Vivo and Oppo photos look more natural in terms of color reproduction. The Google Pixel image turned out to be overly saturated, leaning towards a yellow-orange hue. Also, photos from the Pixel are a bit more noisy than those of the competition. Next photo. Let's immediately look at the night sky and see that everyone didn't do very well. On the Find X8 Ultra, it looks decent compared to the others, but the photo itself turned out a bit overexposed. The photo on the X Pro XL is noisy and poorly detailed. On the X200 Ultra, the sky appears hazy, but in terms of details and exposure, the photos generally look good. And finally, we're seeing poor handling of lights on all the smartphones again. In terms of exposure, the photos from the Vivo and Oppo turned out better than those on the Google Pixel, where it's almost impossible to make out the building in the background. The photos are similar in detail. Now we're testing long exposure shooting. The Pixel has a separate mode for that, and it's called exactly that. Vivo labels this photo as long exposure. It's great that the smartphone immediately offers us several convenient presets for different shooting scenarios. Oppo also has a similar mode, long exposure, which is hidden in the More section. Here, as with Vivo, we see templates, but there are fewer of them. Let's see what we got. In my opinion, Vivo delivered the most interesting result. The photo is bright, saturated, with long light trails. The light trails with Oppo also look great, but the photo is too dark, and the trails on the Pixel weren't as impressive. Let's see what the smartphones offer for shooting the night sky. The X Pro XL implemented this in an interesting way. In night mode, we have 3 levels of zoom available. The shutter icon now displays stars. A neat feature. We tap it, and the smartphone starts recording with a very long exposure. More than 4 minutes. Absolutely do not take a photo like this handheld. Only on a tripod. By the way, the recording itself also looks great. Animated stars appeared across the entire screen, and sometimes comets fly by too. It's a small detail, but it's nice. Vivo achieves this photo through landscape and night mode. Available zoom levels from ultra-wide to 10x, with an exposure time of 1.5 minutes. On the Oppo, I'm trying to take a photo in scene mode, which should ideally produce a good photo with minimal lighting. The shutter speed is relatively short. Another option is night mode, but even here the shutter speed is quite small. Another option, long exposure mode. But the problem is that there's no preset here for shooting the night sky, so we're working with what we have. The last option, let's set the shutter speed using the Pro mode, which is called Master here. You can disable automatic shutter speed and set it to the maximum, which is 30 seconds. And here I took a few RAW and JPEG photos. Let's compare the results. The first shot turned out best, in my opinion, with the X200 Ultra. The photo is beautiful, saturated, with no noise. The sky looks nice. The Pixel also has a good photo quality-wise, but I don't like the green color. Oppo gave a very dark result. You can hardly see anything here at all. Second take. And here, all three gave a good result. The difference boils down to brightness and color reproduction. It all depends on your preferences, friends. Now let's try photographing the moon with our smartphones. It's become much easier to photograph the moon on the Google Pixel, as the 10th generation has a 100x zoom. We're taking photos in the standard photo mode. On the Vivo, we're taking photos in landscape and night mode. At the same time, the smartphone automatically enables a moon effect on large zooms. We're shooting the moon in normal photo mode on the Oppo. I tried taking pictures in night mode, but it just ended up being an overexposed blob. Let's compare the results. None of the smartphones were able to bring out the details of the moon on the main lenses. At 30x zoom, Vivo and Oppo produced images with similar detail. The only difference was in the lighting. The Pixel overexposed the moon, and the photo's detail was very weak. At 100x zoom on Google, we got a photo without overexposure, but frankly, it was smoothed out and artificially enhanced. With Oppo at 120x zoom, we captured the most detailed photo. On the Vivo with the 105x zoom, the details are slightly worse, and there's that orange tint again. The Vivo offers a cool AI visual feature. It lets you apply various AI filters to photos immediately after taking them. As you can see, there are quite a few different effects available. This is what we end up with. We finished our shooting, now let's move on to the studio tests. But before that, let's assess how the batteries fared after the shooting. We started the shooting day with a 100% charge, and by evening, the Pixel 10 Pro XL retained 44%, the X200 Ultra 33%, and the X8 Ultra 29%. On the second shooting day, Google had 63% remaining, Vivo had 54%, and Oppo also had 54%. It's important to mention the operating systems versions we had on all three smartphones at the time of filming this review. You can see them on the screen now. As for the technical specifications, the new Google flagship has a 5,200 mAh lithium-ion battery. The smartphone supports 45-watt wired charging and 25-watt wireless charging. The Vivo X200 Ultra has a silicon carbon battery with a capacity of 6,000 mAh. It supports 90-watt wired charging and 40-watt wireless charging. The Oppo has a silicon carbon battery with a capacity of 6,100 mAh. It supports 100-watt wired charging and 50-watt wireless charging. All three also support reverse charging. Let's talk about the displays. The Google Pixel 10 Pro XL features a 6.8-inch Super Actua OLED screen with a resolution of 1344 by 2992 pixels. The claimed peak brightness reaches up to 3300 nits. The Vivo X200 Ultra is equipped with a 6.82-inch AMOLED display with a resolution of 3168 by 1440 pixels. Its claimed peak brightness is 4500 nits. The Oppo Find X8 Ultra received an AMOLED display with the same screen size and resolution as the Vivo, but the peak brightness reaches up to 2500 nits. All three have an adaptive refresh rate from 1 to 120 Hz. And here are the results we got in our peak brightness measurements. The Pixel 10 Pro XL showed only 201 candles per square meter. That's a very modest result, especially compared to the competition. We measured 353 nits on the X200 Ultra and 316 on the Find X8 Ultra. But what about in practice? We can genuinely see a difference in peak screen brightness when watching content. If the brightness of the Pixel and Vivo looks comparable at a glance, the Oppo screen does appear slightly less bright. Although, not many people will be watching content at maximum brightness. Therefore, a different indicator is more important to us: screen flicker. Let's move on to measuring the PWM frequency. At maximum brightness, the Pixel shows 64%, Vivo shows less than 10%, and Oppo is just above 8%. At 50% brightness, the difference is even more noticeable. The Pixel's flicker jumps to 118%, Vivo shows just 6.6%, and we see around 10% on the Oppo. At minimum brightness, the 10 Pro XL has nearly 50% PWM, the X200 Ultra has around 5%, and the X8 Ultra has roughly 10%. Also, the Pixel has a brightness adjustment feature enabled for sensitive eyes. And we measured PWM again. Let's compare the results with this feature on and off. At maximum brightness, we got almost 53% with the adjustment enabled, compared to 63% with it disabled. At 75% brightness, it's almost 49% versus 65%. At half brightness, it's around 59% versus 114%. At 25% brightness, we get a PWM value of just over 43% versus 85%. At minimum brightness, it's around 24% versus 42%. So this feature will be very helpful for people with sensitive eyes. Now let's conduct performance tests. The Pixel 10 Pro XL received Google's brand new Tensor G5 processor. It works in conjunction with the Titan M2 coprocessor, and the IMG DXT video chip now handles graphics. The X200 Ultra is equipped with a Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Elite processor. The Adreno 830 handles graphics. The Find X8 Ultra also has a chip from Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Extreme Edition. The graphics are the same as on the Vivo. Let's run the first Antutu benchmark. The Oppo Find X8 Ultra finished the test first, following was the Vivo X200 Ultra, and the Pixel 10 Pro XL was last. Oppo also scored the highest. Vivo conceded a bit, but the Pixel turned out to be significantly weaker than the competitors in all aspects. Now let's move on to the Geekbench test. The Find X8 Ultra was the first to complete the processor benchmark. Vivo finished almost simultaneously, and the Pixel 10 Pro XL noticeably lagged behind them. And here we see again that the CPU in the Pixel significantly lags behind the competition. The difference between the Chinese flagships is minimal, with a slight edge going to Oppo. Vivo completed the GPU tests the fastest, Oppo followed, and the Pixel was last again. Here's the scoring breakdown. The Pixel scored 3,095, Vivo scored 18,711, and Oppo scored 17,803. And the third test is 3D Mark, where we check the smartphones for stability under prolonged load. And this is where the 10 Pro XL really shines. It turned out to be the most stable of the three, with a stability score of 75.2%. Vivo and Oppo, on the other hand, scored around 50%. We're also interested in the heating of the smartphones here. The program itself shows a maximum of 44 degrees Celsius on the left and 50 degrees in the center and on the right. However, during the test, we recorded the Google Pixel heating up to 44.5 degrees. The Vivo reached almost 53 degrees, and the Oppo around 50. Now let's check the Wi-Fi network speeds. We're conducting measurements one by one. The Pixel achieved a download speed of up to 560 megabit per second. The upload speed was approximately 390 megabit per second. Vivo achieved 572 and 435 megabit per second respectively. That's the best result. Oppo showed up to 548 megabit per second for downloads and 418 for uploads. Vivo also has the most stable connection with the lowest latency, while Pixel and Oppo have higher ping. Now let's measure the mobile network speed. The operators have the same tariff plans. Vivo shows the best result. Download speed up to 119 megabit per second, upload speed of 33 megabit per second, and minimal ping. The Pixel reaches download speeds of up to 60 megabit per second, but the upload speed is just above 1 megabit per second. And the latency is the highest, around 143 milliseconds on average. Oppo showed download speeds of up to 103 megabit per second, but the upload speed is only 4 megabit per second, and the ping is around 59 milliseconds. Now let's take a little break and listen to some music, friends. I suggest you evaluate for yourselves, by ear, how the speakers of these three smartphones perform. What did I hear? The Pixel delivers good, loud, and clear sound with a confident bass. The Vivo, on the other hand, sounded quieter and less deep than the 10 Pro XL. Oppo is comparable to the Pixel in terms of loudness, but delivers a less bass-heavy sound with pronounced mid-frequencies. However, this is of course a very individual preference. It's also important to keep in mind that video on YouTube doesn't convey the full richness of the sound, especially since all these smartphones have stereo speakers. Let's see what intelligent features each system offers. The limitation immediately surfaced with the Pixel. The proprietary magical suggestions aren't available in many languages. That means if your region isn't supported, you won't be able to use it fully without changing the language and region of the interface. Basically, Magic Q is a contextual assistant that analyzes the screen content and suggests relevant actions, as well as data from Gmail, Calendar, and other services. Suggestions appear right when you're using it, and all processes are performed locally on the device to preserve privacy, according to Google. Vivo and Oppo also have their own assistants and AI options, but they're only geared towards the Chinese market, and outside of it, they work about 99% of the time. All these Brino AI, Andes GPT, payment systems, and smart assistants are currently only functional in China. And since we're talking about smart features, let's see how the smartphones remove objects from photos. Google Pixel calls this option Magic Eraser, and it works great. The apple simply vanished and the hand still looks realistic. But, unfortunately, it doesn't work flawlessly with all photos. Sometimes the smartphone can't even select such a large object in a photo, and after processing, we see something like this nightmare. But still, it is possible to achieve a normal result, and that's the main thing. With Vivo, object removal worked differently. The apple really disappeared, but a large shadow of it remained on the hand. And finally, we're trying to remove an object on the Oppo smartphone. It decided that there shouldn't be an empty space and drew some kind of cosmetic jar or something similar. Write your suggestions in the comments, friends. Well, friends, let's wrap things up. And as tradition dictates, we'll start with the prices of these smartphones. I purchased the brand new Pixel 10 Pro XL from a reseller for around $1,215. This is the 256GB version. I bought the Vivo at launch, and it cost me approximately $1399 for the 1TB version. I also bought the Oppo Find X8 Ultra when it first launched, and it cost me €1,042, or roughly $1,200. So, what to choose? It all depends on your needs. Do you love filming videos with the front-facing camera? Then the Vivo X200 Ultra is definitely not for you. The front camera here is a real problem. It's practically the Achilles heel of this smartphone. In video mode, it offers extremely weak stabilization, and the image quality often falls short of competitors, both in daylight and in low-light conditions. The Pixel produced a slightly better result. The dynamic range is noticeably wider. However, I didn't really like the skin tone. It looks unnatural. The Oppo Find X8 Ultra really shines when it comes to the front-facing camera. In terms of video recording, especially using the main camera system, it definitively takes first place among these three. Confident recording on the ultra-wide, the main lens, and the telephoto, all excellent, and noticeably improved stabilization. It performed much better compared to our competitors. It delivered higher detail, better color reproduction, and improved stabilization across all zoom levels. By the way, it took an honorable third place in our large ranking of smartphones for video recording in 2025. Wonder which two flagships ultimately surpassed Vivo? Then be sure to click the link in the description. For video recording with the main camera system, I would place the Pixel 10 Pro XL in second place. It delivered a decent image quality and good video, however, things are quite sad with these 8K modes and enhanced video features. Processing these videos takes a very long time and the implementation is extremely weak. And unfortunately, in third place, it's the Oppo Find X8 Ultra. Video recording with the main camera block is clearly not Oppo Find X8 Ultra's forte. The image quality turned out to be quite average, the quality is so-so, the detail is lower than the competition's, and the stabilization is weaker. Overall, it's definitely not flagship level. And when we were shooting with this smartphone in pro mode, logarithmic shooting, and also HDR shooting, the image was really unstable. Even though I was standing, I didn't move at all. I was just standing and shooting, but the image was really shaky. Okay, let's talk about the photo capabilities of these smartphones. And without a doubt, the Vivo X200 Ultra takes the first honorable place in terms of photography. The front-facing camera on the Vivo works quite well, but the main camera system really impresses me. The portrait mode shooting here is absolutely stunning. This smartphone lets you take stunning raw photos that can then be flexibly edited in a photo editor. I'm really pleased with the super raw photo capabilities on this smartphone. It performs well in both good and low light conditions. In almost all tests, and especially in night mode, it showed itself more confidently than its competitors. Excellent photo quality from all the lenses, great reach, and high detail. As for macro photography, it doesn't even give Google Pixel a chance. Moreover, none of today's competitors offers such variety and flexibility in photo shooting. And no one has a telephoto lens as powerful as this one, with 200 megapixels. And for second place in photography, I'm putting the Oppo Find X8 Ultra. The photos from the Oppo are also quite good, especially in portrait mode. Natural color reproduction. There are no serious errors in the blur boundary. Regarding the front camera photography, Vivo and Oppo perform roughly the same. The picture quality is really good. The only thing is that in low light conditions, the Find X8 Ultra handles it slightly better. In auto mode, the screen backlight almost always turns on here in low light. And that's why the Oppo front camera performed the best in low light conditions. If you're not a fan of the overly processed images Vivo produces, then Oppo definitely exposes less. Oppo Find X8 Ultra portrait shots also look more natural. The zoom range is quite good too. Detail at high zoom levels is on point. A drawback of the Oppo Find X8 Ultra is raw shooting in low light conditions. Unfortunately, this mode doesn't work well on this smartphone. And in third place is the Google Pixel 10 Pro XL. The portrait mode is very weak. Only 2 zoom levels are preset. If you zoom manually, the maximum we get is just 3x. It can't even shoot portraits using the telephoto lens. The blur here is applied post-factum only. Yes, the portraits turn out quite good. They look very natural. If you happen to like natural-looking photos, then the Google Pixel 10 Pro XL would be a very good choice. However, the raw images from the Pixel are excellent. Quite high quality, especially in low light. In this regard, it's one of the best smartphones. Now let's talk about the hardware and operating system. When it comes to hardware, Chinese flagships definitely look more interesting than the Pixel. They have more powerful processors. As a result, they also boast higher performance. And they have significantly less screen flicker. In all tests, Vivo and Oppo showed roughly the same results. They work significantly faster than the Google Pixel. These smartphones have very low PWM though. Unfortunately, the Google Pixel still has quite a high PWM. But it's good that Google has finally listened to its users and implemented a feature that genuinely reduces PWM by half. Even with this feature, the PWM level is still noticeably higher in low light compared to Vivo and Oppo. The 10 Pro XL, despite having less powerful hardware, runs cooler and drains the battery slower because of it. In terms of the operating system, the Pixel outperforms Vivo and Oppo. Google services, of course, are immediately available without any issues, and the language support here works noticeably better. Speaking of AI features and the operating system, the Google Pixel 10 Pro XL definitely looks much more interesting. Unfortunately, Vivo and Oppo are exclusively released on the Chinese market. And because of that, all AI features are available only for the Chinese market. Looking at the appearance of these smartphones, I like the one from Google, the Pixel 10 Pro XL, the most. It actually looks very cool. It's very well thought out. The ergonomics here really please me. The only thing is the power button. I don't think the placement is very successful. It's located at the top. The volume rocker is at the bottom. Nice, beautiful glossy edges, a good, beautiful glass surface. When you hold this smartphone, you really feel that it's a premium device. Very cool, very pleasant to the touch. I'm really happy that the camera block is positioned horizontally like this, and that means your finger or tripod will never get in the ultra-wide lens. That's of course super convenient. In terms of visual quality, I put the Google Pixel at number 1. I would place the Oppo Find X8 Ultra in second place. I find this smartphone quite comfortable to hold. It has very nice rounded edges. However, for someone unfamiliar with Chinese smartphones, it will be difficult to tell which phone you're holding. I think the Oppo Find X8 Ultra feels a bit more comfortable in hand because the camera block isn't so large here. And also, this extra button on the side is really great too. You can assign an additional function to it. And the third place goes to the Vivo X200 Ultra. It has a very large camera block. It might not be familiar to everyone. It's going to be really difficult to reach the top of the screen with one finger without accidentally smudging the lens. That's because the camera block is quite large. The Vivo X200 Ultra has an aluminum back, and I've already scratched it a little. While the Pixel looks really nice, there are no scratches here. It's glass, and I think it's made really well. And the Oppo also has a very nice finish. I think it feels like glass to the touch, and again, there are no scratches on the Oppo either. Although I've had this smartphone just like the Vivo X200 Ultra for over 6 months now. Friends, and the main question, which of these 3 smartphones would I choose for myself? And my answer? Vivo X200 Ultra. The best photo capabilities. Amazing video recording on the main camera system. Unreal, incredibly cool time lapses. I really love this smartphone. And when my family and I go on trips, this smartphone always comes with me. And if you enjoyed this video and found it useful, be sure to like it, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments which smartphone you would choose for yourself. And goodbye everyone.